Okay, so one thing I like about looking at first books and in comparison with later books is that you can see how the author revisits ideas that they've been toying with for a while. So with On Wings Made of Gauze, she has a lot of Black women tributes and a lot of women tributes that you see recurring throughout her work, but Nikky Finney handles them differently in this first book. They are made in a kind of general way towards all women or all Black women in the first book. Later on, you're more likely to see direct tributes to direct people with specific details from their lives. You also see her revisiting the topic of family, of her mother, of her father, aunts, uncles, specific individuals reappear in these books as you read the rest of her writing, and she handles them each in different ways. So I want to look specifically at page 48, the 20th Psalm in On Wings Made of Gauze, and then I want to compare it to the Afterbirth 1931 in Rice, which was the second book. So the 20th Psalm goes, "Grandmother died at 20 while giving birth to my father." So it starts in this third person perspective. Seems a little removed. Seems, even in those first three lines, seems to be recording data. So while giving birth to my father, while giving life to her dream, and so while giving life to her dream is supposed to add more weight, right? A more emotional weight. She died of complications, line break, formalities. This is a line that will be repeated. They say, also a line that will be repeated. So we see here that Nikky is questioning what actually happened, right? But we don't really get the full breadth of how she's questioning and why she's questioning. Swept the South Virginia breath from her young body, sealed her eyes before they had a chance to see her creation. Again, these lines are supposed to add more emotional weight. Her creation. A simple woman, this line will be repeated, wanting only to be known for the birth of a son, died penniless, of no great deeds, of no major accomplishments. Simple woman, succumbed to complications and formalities, they say. So those last 5 lines are repeated lines. Now, this is a good poem, of course. Then the question is, why would she feel the need to rewrite it? What could this add to it? And I think a hint comes from the lines that say, she was a simple woman wanting only to be known for the birth of a son, died penniless, of no great deeds, of no major accomplishments. And that portion feels not only removed and factual, but also a little like it's assessing the value of the grandmother's life, right? It sounds removed in time, in emotional distance, and rhetorical distance. So Nikky, liking the concept but having wanting to change that, writes Afterbirth. Here are some key changes that were made between these two versions. First of all, the point of view. Change the point of view from grandmother died at 20 and she, right? From that third person perspective to a first person perspective. So the Afterbirth 1931 reads, "We were a colored clan of kinfolk." So already we have alliteration there in that first line. we have the first person perspective. And the alliteration does something to unite the line as well as that we, right? Then the strategic use of repetition. Why didn't I write that down? Okay. I didn't write that down. I wrote it all over every place else. So the strategic use of repetition. So think about the way that a line when repeated can shift meaning, can carry more weight. As think about it as scaffolding. She scaffolds this repetition throughout the poem. So she starts with, we were a colored clan of kinfolk, and then she says, we were a family pregnant. Then later she says, we were a pregnant clan of kinfolk. So now she's mixing the lines together, but she's still repeating this, we were this, we were that. She repeats, and I'll just go through this quickly. She starts in the first stanza with throwing soil, not salt. So throwing soil, good soil being a source of luck in the Low Country, South Carolina. Then, and that's in the first stanza. In the second stanza, she comes back to black soil, and she comes back to it later in the text. She comes back to 10 roofs, to tendered close the Bible, right? Several times. Comes back to, let's see, the idea of planting the next row, planting what, in that first stanza, it's what to plant at first light. She's talking about the almanac. And then in the third stanza, she's talking about to begin our next row. So planting being the next generation of people. She comes back to the idea of the guy, the doctor, the white doctor, being medically degreed in baby bringing and having papers to prove it, and having papers to prove it, and having papers to prove it. He shows up to the house with his papers. These are, and every time you see the papers, it's in a slightly different context, which means it carries a different kind of weight, an emotional weight. So if we're talking about learning the skill of repetition, young poets, sometimes they might be like, repetition, like their teachers, that's what they sound like in my head. Their teachers are like, okay, here's some devices I want you to use in your poem. Use repetition, and it's like, I don't want to repeat myself. But if we look at the way Nikky is using it here, this is a masterclass on repetition. I need to do a 2-minute line break on this poem. It's too long. But either way, I wouldn't be able to do that on Instagram, but it is a masterclass on repetition. So even the way she says in the 4th paragraph near the beginning, she says, old families say they can remember. Old families say they can remember. Old families say they can remember. She repeats that as she continues with the poem. Where he put his hands up and then inside. Precious, private, pleasing place. Again, alliteration, but also she repeats that phrase. Old-timey family, old family. They say remember, old-timey family remember him well. Say they knew something wasn't right as he came to the door. A day later, his breakfast digested now. Something just wasn't right. Repeating, something just wasn't right. Repeating that he had breakfast first. Repeating that he came a day later. Whereas in the 3rd paragraph, he came so soon, so convincing, so soon after his so soon line break. After his Ivy graduation, right? So that's a key line break, but so that you can interpret it 2 different ways. He came soon, but he also came soon after his graduation. And then contrast that to the repetition later of him coming late, of him waiting a day. So there's a lot of repetition that goes on in this, and I don't want to, I have to say this. On page 69, where he, she repeats the facts of the situation over and over. Like the baby was broken, the baby he pulled the baby wrong and all this. But there's this place on page 69 where she says, then he packed his bag and left with all his official training, the papers, and gathered up his gold stars, the papers. Left, again, left. The Virginia land of Cumberland County. He left and forgot. Now, previously in the poem, we kept on talking about the old-timey folks say they can remember. They say they can remember. They say they can remember. And here, this man forgot. He left and forgot. He left and didn't remember the afterbirth inside. Oh, I mean, repetition. It's that. So it's the shifting of the context around the phrase or word that's being repeated. He packed his bag, space, and left. Then we refer back to the papers and say he left again. Then we refer to the place. And all this has to do with pacing, so I'll talk about that in a second. But before I get to that, I'm gonna talk about it now. More stuff gets repeated as this poem gets built. So the moral of that story, the repetition part, is that as readers and writers, let's think about scaffolding repetition in strategic ways that have this impact, a different kind of impact every time it's repeated. Let's talk a little bit about pacing, and then let's also talk about narrative. So in the first poem, in the On Wings Made of Gauze version of the poem, this poem, we know there is a narrative behind it, but it is written in a way that rejects the narrative. It's written in a way that is more focused on that poetic terseness, that I mean, how else do I describe it other than poetic terseness? It's like when you're trying to be economical with your words and trying to fit the scene in this very small poetic space. This is what that first version of the poem does. The second version of the poem is like, forget that. I want to write a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 page poem, and you're just gonna have to be okay with that. It really embraces narrative, this second version, and so it is focused on story. So it has a different focus than the first version of the poem, but that intentionally leaning into narrative is one of the other key changes. It's the second key change that I'm gonna name here, and then I'm gonna add the third, which is pacing. So as we're talking about narrative, we're talking about the way it paces down the page. She does not, in the first version, she tells you the end up front. Grandmother died at 20 while giving birth to my father. In the second version, she does not start there. She starts, we were a colored clan of kinfolk who threw soil, not salt, for luck, right? So we're, even in that line, not salt, it's there establishing a clear cultural difference. It's setting conflict in that second line. Hold on, let me tell you. Sorry. It sets conflict there in that second line just by establishing difference. Let me write that down, because that conflict is right there, conflict. So it starts, we were a colored clan of kinfolk who threw soil, not salt, over our shoulders, who tendered the Bible, who grew and passed around the almanac so we would know what to plant at first light. So the fourth thing I want to mention is characterization. Right here, because we're leaning into narrative and slowing down the pacing, we have time to characterize who the players are in this story. And so in the first stanza, I say paragraph, I'm going to say stanza. In the first stanza, we already have detail about who they are and who they are not. They are not those salt people. They still believe, at the same time they believe in the luck of the soil over the shoulder, they also believe in the Bible. And the almanac. So we're talking about like three core beliefs that govern their lives, and we got that in the first stanza. This characterization is like creating this emotional attachment by just exposing us to who the people are. So the fifth thing I'm going to name is, say, the key difference here is showing, not telling. You get to see and meet the people, the characters in this poem, in the entire poem, but for example here in this first paragraph. I guess that's number 6 because I said alliteration. I've lost count now, so I'm just going to keep naming things. Show, not tell, pacing, So I do want to talk a little bit more about conflict. If we look at the way that the second stanza works, so we get some more characterization. We return to black soil and sweet brown sorghum. So we return also to the fields, what gets planted at night. From the every morning biscuits Mama Susan fixed, dripping and mixing up under our fingernails, a secret salve just like any other living simple, and keeping to our proud selves. Now here's a shift. So that was characterization. Here we get a little conflict. Quite aware of night riders. It gives us context as well. Quite aware of men with politicious smiles. Oh, I love that phrase, politicious. I want to call somebody that. Anyway, who walked by, cologned with kerosene and match. I mean, we're also characterizing these other players in the story, the players who are outside of this family. We're getting characterization here. We're getting conflict here. Key elements of narrative. So let me write characterization down too. Aware of just whose feet walked across our tin roofs at night. So we're back to characterizing the family. We were such light sleepers, such long distance believers. That phrase right there, long distance believers, I'm not sure what it means, but I have given it about 15 definitions because it's just accurate for many different situations. Long distance believers, you know exactly what it means, and your definition is different from mine. So here we see her pulling in conflict. Now, if we go back to the first version, because this version is more focused on terseness and economy, it doesn't have the space to really delve into those storytelling elements. If you had to say what the conflict was in this version of the poem, what would you say? We know that she died. We know that there were complications and formalities, they say, so we know there's suspicion there, but we're not sure about the details or why there's suspicion there. We're not sure why the suspicion exists in that version of the poem. So aside from conflict, I do want to talk about the time setting here in between the two poems. The first poem, the grandmother died at 20 while giving birth to my father. It is clearly in the very long distance time. It's in the far past. It's decades from the speaker of the poem. In the second version of the poem, we feel much closer to the moment that it happened, right? So we get the indication because of the title, 1931. We get the indication that this is a grandmother. But it's not really detailed here in the poem. In the poem, the speaker is one of the people standing in the house who says, we should have sniffed this guy's breath through the screen door, rusty screen door, without even opening this thing. This person is not only in the house experiencing the moment, but the person, the speaker, who is in the house is also in the body of the pregnant woman, because the speaker keeps saying we were a family pregnant, right? We are what are broke. So it keeps establishing, I mean, it's so much closer to not only the moment in time, but also the issue of the conflict, right? It's closer to the actual action of the story. The first poem is much further away from the action and from the time period. Okay, and finally, I want to talk about risk, but before I talk about risk, I want to get into talk about structure a little bit. So in the first part of the poem, we have Nikky establishing the story, right? This is what happened. And she's, again, showing that telling. So, like, we get a sense that we are actually in this room. We can see the people in the room and what they're wearing and smell what they smell like, kerosene or whatever. And smell the smell of the gangrene that was there for 9 days. Then there's a shift after that gangrene on page 70. We get a shift in the first full stanza that says, we were a brown and pregnant family, and he would have remembered his school, and remember is repeated. And left, right? Left is repeated. His bottle, recollected, remember, his manners, and brought his right mind, and brought his right mind, had another clan, spelled with a K this time, called him to their bedside. He would have come right away. He would have never had, so right here in this paragraph, stanza, what I'm trying to point out here is that we have a transition into he would have done this if this, he would have done this if this, whereas all that came before is he did this, we did this, we thought this. That's everything that came before. What comes after this transition turns into we should have. So we transition into this wishful, imaginative moment. Imagine, so if we're talking about strategy as a writer, we have a stanza and a half of characterization at the beginning. We have a half stanza of conflict, another stanza of characterization, and then that 1, 2, 3, 4th stanza has conflict, contrasting the old and the new, contrasting the new, shiny, handsome white doctor with the tried and true black grannies who lay the axe blade up under the bed in the water. We have that kind of description and establishing conflict. And then that continues characterization, conflict, explanation of the reasoning and all that other stuff. And then we get to page 70 where we get a transition paragraph that says, well, what would he have done if we were white? Here's a stanza. Why do I keep saying paragraph? Both genres, I've been doing both genres recently. Here's a stanza where that we get the answer to that question, what would he have done if this family were white? And then we get several stanzas after that of what the family, the core family in this poem should have done. So we get this wishful imagination. So I'm saying those pieces to you to say, if you are writing your own poetry, here's a template that you can follow. If you're writing a narrative poem, here's a template that you can follow, because not only do you have access to what actually happened, but you have access to what would have happened and what should have happened. So this is a moment where she gets to add depth to the poem. And we're still using this mode of repetition. We're still And then for good measure should have made him blow once again into Papa Josh's truth-telling jar. I want to see this jar. I need a truth-telling jar. Should have let Mama Sally do this. Should have let Mama Sally do this, and these other characters, these other aunts, and give him a final once over and hold his sterile hands down to the firelight to check, just like she checked us every night before supper, before we could sit at her table, let alone put our hands anywhere else. She checked our hands, right? We could have let Aunt Ira clutch him by the chin, just like the way she did us. She would have taken care to notice all these other things. And then the interjection, oh, Jesus, right? So that it reinserts this immediacy, like that expression puts us so close to the action where the regret is so tangible. It's just right there that we're still like in this moment where you're expressing regret through these kind of interjections. Oh, Jesus, I didn't even know oh, Jesus was an interjection until reading this poem. And I was like, yeah, they didn't teach us that in 3rd grade. They taught us, our 7th grade, they taught us, wow, whoa, oh, But of course, we got different interjections. We got, oh, Jesus, Lord of mercy. Those are interjections too. And so here we should have let Grandpa Robert do such and such, just like he did to us. We should have let Grandpa loose on him, just like when he held us up. We should have done this, just like the way he treated us, right? But even the family is like each one of them individually, it goes through, and questions why they question their own intuition, right? But never in a way that blames, because it's always we, the collective first person, is always central to these statements, which means it doesn't sound like an indictment. It sounds like pure regret. And that point of view is so key to that. Then we end with waterfalls running down our legs, right? Again, back to our water breaking, right? We are still standing there. Let's see. Trusting and believing we're doing better by this one standing there with waterfalls running, screaming white rapids down our pants legs, down our pantaloons to our mini selves, all while praying hard and praying. We come back to that repetition that maybe we were wrong. Please make us wrong. And so then you even have a prayer inserted right in there. The immediacy of that regret is we are still very close to that moment, and it's evident here. Please make us wrong, and 100 proof smelled the same as isopropyl. Whew. All right. So one thing, oh, this is a long video. All right, I'll finish up. The last thing I wanted to talk about is risk. The risk of the second version of the poem is much different than the risk of the first version of the poem. In the first version, and risk is something that I have difficulty with as a writer, but as a reader, you know when it's there, you know when it's not. What's at risk? What's at stake? What's at risk for the writer? What's at risk for the characters in the moment? So here in the first version, there isn't a strong risk there. Things already seem set and done, and it does not seem risky for the writer to imagine her way through this poem. In the second version of the poem, there is a lot of risk. In order to imagine her way through this, she has to also imagine her own fault, her family member's fault, her own regret, right? imagine the reasons why. Why would these decisions be made? Wanting to do better. Well, what does wanting to do better look like when you suddenly have tobacco money? Well, it looks like getting somebody who's officially approved to do a thing that's important for the family, which is birth this baby. What does officially approved look like? It looks white. And then another question, what's at risk? Can we actually be treated as equal if we can afford the service? The answer turns out being no. The what's at risk, whether or not you trust your own intuition, whether or not you are willing, if we're talking about equality and being treated equal, are you willing to treat this white guy equal to everybody else? And to treat him equal would mean stopping him at the door and putting your noses to the screen and saying, go back home. You're a day late anyway. Don't worry about it. We handled it, right? That would be like equal treatment. But of course, the context is completely different. So it's like, 1931. What else is different? Questioning standard rules. In order to treat this guy as an equal, you have to like question all of the rules of the society. That is risky behavior. What would the results of doing that possibly be? If they did disrespect this man and send him home, or even respectfully, the baby's already, and he's probably gonna still try to charge his fee. Anyway, whew. And a last bit of risk. We were pregnant in this poem, not they or she or whatever. And by us being pregnant, when we died too. We died in this poem too. And so I think that's a huge bit of risk as well. So we're talking about, by exploring all of that stuff, we're exploring in very specific ways, ways that are very tied to the time period, to the people, to the family. We're able to talk about these broader issues of equality, of what can currency actually buy, of what does intuition mean in an unequal society? What does it mean in a kind of equal society? What does it mean when one thing happens to one of us? What does it mean to come up? What about this emblematic moment reflects our current healthcare issues? So by delving into this and teasing it out more, we are able to find more in the narrative that she builds through this poem. So that is a talk on revision. I hope it's helpful. If you are writing and you're trying to revise, try long, try changing the point of view, try repetition, try figuring out what phrases are most important for this new version of the poem. Is it succumb to complications and formalities, they say? And how, if so, I bet that phrase was inspiration for this new version of the poem that kind of, well, what do you mean they say? And what do you mean complications? And what do you mean formalities? Formalities being like this whole atmosphere of racism. What do you guys think?